I am pleased to introduce to you Alphonse Kanda, who has been a logotherapist, a clinician diplomate for 15 years, and he is originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo and is now the medical director of psychiatry of the psychiatric ward in Pretoria, one of the largest psychiatric wards in the area. And he has been involved since receiving his diplomate in 2008 in the training and supervision of logotherapists. And I'm very pleased to introduce Alphonse Kanda, Dr. Alphonse Kanda.
Thank you, Charles. Through you, allow me to greet everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And I'd like as well, through you, to express my gratitude for being given this opportunity to share some thoughts and experiences around logotherapy, clinical anthropology in a clinical setting, looking at how we can bridge the gaps caused by violence and suffering. I thought that I should share some of these quotes. These are written by some medical anthropologist who says, given the persistence of so much human suffering in the new millennium, medical anthropology has a clear role to play in understanding and alleviating the global burden of mental health problems. And one of the great anthropologists and the psychiatrists, Arthur Kleinman, said one of the challenging, he was in the same book reflecting on the different challenging 5 questions of medical anthropology. He said one of them was this question: what is the difference between social suffering and mental health problems? Having said that, it's important, and I believe as well that another writer said that in clinical, or many other observers have said that in clinical practice, actually suffering is often overlooked. We generally, like in medicine, use the 4 vital signs. Even now we have the 5th one, the oxygen saturation, especially since we went through the COVID pandemic. These vital signs do not tell us anything about suffering. And in general, the dominant medical model overlook the experience of suffering in the assessment of the disease and prevent the application of psycho, social, cultural, and existential intervention. Another group of anthropologists led by Paul Farmer, also when reflecting in terms of social suffering and violence, said in one of their papers that medical professionals are not trained to make structural intervention. And it's important here to mention that Paul Farmer and some of other medical anthropologists have suggested that there are 2 types of intervention, what they call the distal intervention, which is mainly around providing medication, and the proximal intervention, which is about providing housing and other means of living. But you'd realize that these 2 interventions do not still address suffering and its impacts on the individual and the community. And another philosopher, I believe, in reflecting on medicine and suffering, suggested that in general, in medicine, we have 3 attitudes when it comes to dealing with suffering. The one is fix it, the other one, face it or forget about it. And he goes further to say that the medical attempt to fix all suffering generates its own unique kind of suffering. the devastation of unintended consequences, and more fundamentally, the deprivation of human value. And he says again that when we can't fix problem, this is generally in medicine, our impulse is to ignore it, look it away, or even destroy those who have it. But he says ultimately that to forget about suffering is to lose our humanity. And actually, I would suggest that any clinical practice which does not consider the suffering of the clients, it's actually committing a kind of structural violence, because that suffering would continue going on and not being attended to. So the same psychiatrist and then medical anthropologist, Kleinman, who observed that after reflecting about the challenging question of medical anthropology, he made this observation that we are in an era where anthropologists have to move from the margin to the center. And in one of his books, he concluded his book by saying, perhaps my effort in these pages will contribute to the building of a moral movement for care, where others will pick up the torch and realize more fully its significance for us all. It is in this spirit that I thought that one could also reflect and see what could logotherapy have as a contribution to the challenge of suffering and violence in clinical setting. And in that effort, I've come to suggest that actually logotherapy is a meaning-centered existential anthropology, because it does present a therapeutic way of facing suffering in clinical practice. This would be my outline of my presentation. I would look at the challenges of suffering and violence, and suffering and the existential frustration. Logotherapy, as I said, is a meaning-centered existential anthropology. Logotherapy with the search for meaning. I would then share briefly some of my data I collected in one of my study I conducted some years back, and then would look at the different gaps we can bridge using care as a value. And finally, I would like to submit, especially in this moment with all the turmoil we are going through with the different type of war in different parts of the world, to say that care as a value from a logotherapeutic perspective is, we can submit that care is for peace, health, and development and growth. Basically, the challenges of suffering and violence in clinical setting are many, but one can come up with this category. The challenge can be related to the definition of suffering and pain, as one can realize that it's not always easy to describe and define what is suffering. That becomes quite difficult when it would also make it difficult to communicate the experience of suffering. The other challenge of suffering is that suffering can have multiple causes, and it's not always easy to pinpoint the cause of suffering. And lastly, the other challenge of suffering and violence is the context within which that suffering occurs, because the context, which is social-cultural, is also very complex. Having mentioned these challenges, one would agree that suffering and violence are actually very complex phenomenon. They do have multiple dimensions, which are physical, mental, social, and spiritual, and also they do occur at different levels be it individual, family, and community. It is also important to mention that suffering does not only affect the sufferer, but it does affect the caregiver and the witness. The witness here, I'm thinking of the different health professionals, anyone who gets involved or gets in contact with the person who is going through suffering. One could also think of researchers and so on. And it is important to say that the suffering involves, or it calls actually, the intervention of all healthcare disciplines. The other challenge, which is quite painful and unfortunate, is that for me, that suffering and violence would brings in a vicious spiral of violence and suffering and ill health. That these three, they do entertain themselves and amplify this experience of suffering and violence. When we look at violence, especially in countries like ours, in a continent like ours, in Africa, I'm sure with any other countries as well, besides violence, one would have to think of poverty, which is a form of violence. One might say it's a structural violence, and these comes with displacement, and they generally generate suffering, which can lead to ill health, as previously mentioned, that ill health is not necessarily equal to suffering, and the challenge could be how one differentiates suffering and a disease. So the other challenge is related to the impacts or the consequences of violence and suffering, especially if there is no caring response. One might experience isolation, alienation, dissociation, and the fragmentation of self, and of course, fragmentation of the community and its history. I have come to suggest that this experience of fragmentation of the community on self is actually a kind of the same way one has to orient himself in place, time with a person. There is also an orientation to values. And then suffering and violence can actually trigger or bring one to experience a social-cultural disorientation. And this would connect with what Franco have said as well, that in our society, some of our societies have lost their culture and tradition. Now, having said that, you'd agree that with a meaning-centered orientation, that once one becomes fragmented, in a fragmented or destroyed community with the loss of culture, which include tradition, belief, and values, this can make it difficult or challenging to fulfill the will to meaning, and this can lead to the frustration of the will to meaning. And as we all know in logotherapy, we would say that the frustration of the will to meaning, if not attended to, it's not necessarily pathological. It is actually a sign of our humanness. But if it's not attended to, if it's not addressed in a healthy way, it might lead, and that's why I've said it's a possible door to depression, aggression, and addiction. Of course, here I use this term into a very broad way. We would like to suggest that logotherapy is actually a meaning-centered existential anthropology. The reason I'm saying this is that existential anthropology view would want to see a human being in the world. It would always consider a human being in his or her context. But I would like to submit that from a logotherapy perspective, we would add that it's being in the world with meaning, meaning that we are in a world which is around us, and within that world, if within that context, that where meaning is located. And this would actually support, or it should be supported by what Frankl says, that meaning is actually discovered, is not invented. It is discovered outside, beyond us, in the world. So having said that, is that the logotherapy as an existential anthropology would agree with anthropology by saying that human beings have got this, a number of sorry, for some reason I can't see my screen. Are you with me?
We can see you. I can see your slides, and I can see you just fine.
I don't know why I can't see my.
You can't see your slides?
Screen. Which?
You're on the home screen now with PowerPoint just showing your raw file. So if you hit F5, it will show it again, but we'll need to go down to where you were. That's where you were. That's good.
Yeah, I was here. So
good. Thank you.
Yeah, so we submit that we as a human being, we have different dimensions. And in addition, as I said, that meaning is embedded in the world. We also have an anthropology view of the world or the environment as always made of the visible and invisible world. And that invisible world, we have values and meaning. That still does not mean that these are things we make up. These are real facts which we have. And having said that, because of these approach logotherapy has by introducing the search for meaning or the will to meaning with the values being embedded in the world, I would suggest that we do have then an opportunity to integrate emotion and cognition with motivation, because quite often a number of intervention would look only at emotion and cognition, overlooking the motivation, which is based on the will to meaning. And again, another level of integration here is that of body, mind, and spirit. I would submit that actually by including the human capacity, the human spiritual dimension, that spiritual dimension would help to integrate body and mind. So with that consideration, when we consider that the meaning I'm referring here, as we know, I'm referring here mainly to the meaning of the moment, the meaning of suffering, the moment of suffering. That's the meaning I'm referring to. I'm not referring to ultimate meaning or meaning of life, which is another kind of meaning as well. So the consideration of meaning and spirit definitely assist to establish a human relationship in clinical practice. I would definitely submit that every time we do not consider the spiritual dimension of our client, and if we do not allow to listen, or we do not allow the client to fulfill their will to meaning, we are actually missing them. And once we do that, we would generally help to reduce or remove shame, stigma, avoid the avoidable suffering, because with the unavoidable suffering, sometimes what we need is just to find the right attitude. And this also would help to reduce or remove isolation and alienation. As I said, these are consequences of violence and suffering. Now, the Jackson is one of the existential anthropologists. He does have what he calls an existential commitment, which says no one will have to live or die alone. And I believe this commitment can be sustained by the logotherapy submission that meaning is unconditional. It is available to everyone. There is no condition for one to fulfill his or her meaning. And each moment in life is meaning, including the moment of meaning, the moment of suffering, meaning that suffering does have meaning, which we are called to fulfill. And it is important as well to acknowledge that each life has meaning. So with this submission, it becomes easier then for health professionals to truly be there for all the clients in all throughout their life up until the time when they are in a terminal condition. So such a commitment sustained by this logotherapy submission would definitely result in a sustained empathy and compassion in clinical setting. So the meaning orientation, which maintain that meaning of each moment is fulfilled by realizing values, allows the move from medical paradigm to the relational paradigm, which integrates medical evidence-based approach with value-based approach. I hope you can see here is another third gap between evidence-based and value-based practice. I believe that the orientation of the meaning orientation would allow us to integrate these two approaches. And it's important to acknowledge here that this relational paradigm is in tune with the Ubuntu philosophy which we have in African continent. So logotherapy does make use of phenomenology and narratives. Phenomenology as a study of experience, and narrative as a way of expressing or capturing the experience, including the experience of suffering. And by using these two, phenomenology and narratives, logotherapy would facilitate healing and recovery through the search for meaning. And this search for meaning would help in two ways: by allowing us or allowing the client to have the right attitude, the right mindset in face of suffering. And that mindset, the right mindset, can be healing, especially if one considers the line of psychoneuroimmunology orientation. But the such an approach as well would also allow healing and recovery through healthy lifestyle, meaning through what their clients would do as part of fulfilling their meaning. So it's one of the reasons why we would submit that logotherapy, it's a therapy of action. It's not just about sitting, talking, and reflecting, but it's actually taking action and doing something about one's life. And such an orientation as well would facilitate well-being through the healthy connection with self, others, and nature. So logotherapy in face of suffering in a clinical setting with a search for meaning I would like to submit that suffering, any experience of suffering calls for care. And care here then can be viewed as the main value in clinical practice. And as from the logotherapy perspective, where we have three categories of values, I would like to submit that care can be considered as fulfilling these categories of values, because care can be a gift which is received by the sufferer. In that case, then it becomes an experiential value. It can be a creative value as an act offered by the witness of suffering. And the witness of suffering here could be a caregiver, a health professionals, or any other person, including researchers of suffering and violence. And finally, care can also be considered as an attitudinal value, as it's about the right mode of being or engagement in the moment of suffering. As we would know that when one is experiencing suffering, one is being called to find the right way of engaging with that experience. And this case here, Franco would say, for example, that if it's a avoidable suffering, then the meaningful things to do is to avoid the suffering. So I thought I should share with you briefly, just as an illustration of what I've just said, the impact of suffering and violence in some community where I've conducted an ethnographic study. So this, in this case, is a case of a community in an area called Magaliesburg in South Africa. Historically, this area has been prone to violence, as you can see the timeline. Since 1815, there've been different type of violence, war happening in this area up until the first democratic election. And these various wars, conflicts among different communities have resulted into into 2 centuries of poverty, violence, displacement of people, with a destructive impact on different community with their culture, which include their knowledge and identity. And this would refer to what I had said, the fragmentation of the community, the fragmentation of the identity. So when one conducts a research or even practice in such an environment, one can find quite a number of individuals going through what I've said, a kind of social cultural disorientation, experiencing alienation and isolation, because the family have been dislocated, community have been dislocated, creating gaps between people. And that's entertain violence as well, because now it's about us versus them, and us as an individual as well, not being in the right mindset. So individually, while I was conducting this ethnographic study, I picked up some of these codes just as an illustration of what I've presented as challenges of suffering and violence. One of the research participants who was raped when she was living alone and was preparing for her matric said, no, the problem is that by then, what it happened, I was scared that I was scared that they will say that I am the one who made that person to do it. preferring that she would be blamed that she is the one who invited the person to rape her. This shows the difficulty of people who are going through violence due to traumatic events, not being able to communicate their experience. Another participant said, we were poor because we had to sleep on the floor in a mud house. And when we go to school, we have no shoes. We don't used to cry, but we used to be very sad about that. It used to hurt, but we were afraid to talk about that experience of poverty. Again, here, one is an illustration of how one is totally unable to communicate and express the experience of suffering due to poverty. But then when experiencing a life-threatening condition, in this case, HIV and AIDS, one participant said that if you are HIV positive, there is no way you can live, you're gonna die. I wanted to kill myself before HIV kills me. I took all my medication for bipolar and I drink them. I take them. I wanted to kill myself. I was admitted for overdose. Another research participant said, actually, the day when I find myself that I have HIV, it was a problem, a serious problem. It entered through my mind. Then I told myself that it is the end of the life. So you see as well the impacts of life-threatening condition. And these impacts are very important to be considered when providing care to our client. Of course, then in that context, the client comes as well with existential questions and answers. One of the participants said, why me? And others in my family, they are staying nicely. I just think, oh, why? Why God just select me in my family? I am the only one now. I am the only one. I am the only one who is staying alone. The others, they've got their families, their husbands in their houses, in homes. And me, I'm here in South Africa. And to that question of why me and why this has happened to me, one of the research participants said, God has a purpose for me. However, the other one said, this world is not made for me. You would see that I've put these two answers because they would definitely come or bring some attitude to life. So if being fatalist or hopeless or having some hope that life is still meaningful as regardless of my condition. So it becomes very important that in a clinical setting, we, besides looking at the physical condition, psychological condition, the way the client is thinking or the emotion they are going through, it is important to provide some space to explore the experience of suffering with its possible causes, with the different form of violence, and open a space for looking at possible existential questions the clients might be having, and listen to their answer and see how one can support them in finding the right attitude. And that, I think, is part of care. So I'm going to, toward the end of my presentation, I thought then that one could submit that using logotherapy as a meaning-centered existential anthropology, it would help us to bridge a number of gaps. The first one is that of body and mind. That we can see that how do we link the body to the mind? We do that through the third dimension, which is the spiritual dimension. The other gaps is that of seeing human being through the lens or through the attitude of us versus them. Here again, logotherapy with Frankel would remind us of our shared humanness, our shared humanity. By doing that, we can become more inclusive and seeing our humanity in every human being. The other gap is that of individual versus community. With logotherapy based on the capacity of human being as self-transcendent at a spiritual level, we can facilitate the connection. We can facilitate the clients who is with us in the clinical setting, provide a space where they connect to us as human beings, and we create what I would call a community of care, which would include then the family, the community, and other people. Again, still based on that self-transcendence, one can also use logotherapy which is based on the search for meaning, to allow human being to connect with nature, to connect with their environment, which is another way of bridging the gaps between human being and their context or their nature in this case. And finally, I believe as well that the separation of different health care disciplines does not, especially if they work in isolation, can also amplify suffering and structural violence in providing healthcare service. If all health professionals become in tune in providing care as a goal, that can bring the health professional together, that we can move from the multidisciplinary stand to a transdisciplinary stand. So you can see that with care as a value in a clinical setting, it can allow us to bridge a number of gaps. And finally, I would like to submit that care as a value would facilitate violence, health, development, and growth in all community and for everyone. Dear colleague, this is what I thought I should share with you this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Thank you. Charles, are you with me?
I am. I had to go and start the next session and get that ready to go. So I am back. So are there any questions? Tell us more about you. You told me, but while we were chatting, that you're getting a degree in anthropology, and you mentioned phenomenological stances toward therapy, which Frankl also mentions phenomenology, and he was aware of it. Would you care to talk a little bit more about that? Because you're using that to connect the medical model with Frankl's multidimensional ontology. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Charles, can you repeat? You are referring to an article or anthropology?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
No, I did not get your question. You are saying I refer to anthropology.
Okay, I think you told me you're getting a master's degree in anthropology. Did I hear that correctly?
You know, I've completed my master's in anthropology. Yes, I've completed my master's. And I don't know if you are referring on how one would then bring logotherapy, include it to anthropology, and specifically here into medical anthropology. I would even say clinical anthropology. The challenge I've had in anthropology, like with other school of psychology, there are different school of psychology, as we also have different school of anthropology. You have the, I would say, theoretical orientation that they would study using the critical anthropology or political economy anthropology or ethnomedicine. But I felt that this different school of thought or theoretical orientation were not helping me as a clinician to understand the experience of the client in a clinical setting. And in so searching, I happened to find the orientation of existential anthropology. But then you see, when with existential anthropology, they would use different existential philosopher. And as you know, Franco would say there are many existential orientation depending on the number of philosophers. So I thought one could use specifically the existential logotherapeutic orientation, which is based on the search for meaning. Because this is why I came up with the thought that, yes, then one could say, if we say we are looking at human being in their environment, we always have to consider they are in that environment, not just for the sake of being in the environment, but they are in that environment with meaning waiting for them to fulfill.
Right.
So in this case, we could then apply it in an experience of suffering like HIV and AIDS to remind ourselves that it's not only about doing the test, doing the physical examination, but it's also listening to the person, the experience they are going through, the experience of their suffering, and helping them. By doing so, we need to help them find their meaning in that moment, because meaning is unconditional and any suffering has meaning. So if we allow them, we facilitate the search for meaning, we are actually supporting our medical intervention.
That was really a powerful
That's
example you gave of the AIDS patient who's wondering if he should continue to take his medicine, and had really a struggle for meaning. And I really appreciate your sharing it.
Yeah. Because that's actually, it's something I'm seeing. I don't know other colleague people that now we have medication. Definitely, it have made things much easier. But we do have people, as I said, when they are only provided medication and they are actually doing fine, but they might be still having existential questions. And if those questions are not attended to, they might end up not taking the medication and defaulting. And so that becomes a big challenge. And this is one of the reasons why we do have drug resistance, because people do not take their medication continuously. So I believe that provision, what Paul Farmer, another medical anthropologist, called the distal intervention, providing medication. The medication we provide has to be supported by an existential, meaning-oriented attitude to remind the client that despite what they are going through, life is still meaningful.
There's something greater than themselves that
Exactly.
they are living for. Or
yes.
Also, Frankl was fond of quoting Nietzsche: "He who has a why to live for can endure almost any how." And that how is taking the medication and surviving, but the why is what's far more important than that.
You have said it much better. Thank you.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, no,
Are there any other questions? I think the attendees can unmute themselves if they would like to, or I can unmute them if they'll raise their hands. I don't see any hands raised.
I'm seeing, I don't know if it's a comment or a question. Should I read it?
Oh, sure. Let me see.
Yeah.
Oh, I see it from Doreen, Dr. Francis. Okay. Would you like me to read it?
Yes, please, because we might miss a question there or an opportunity
Thank you,
for,
Dr. Kanda,
yeah.
for a wonderful presentation. I am very interested in further study of suffering and attitude. Although pain is a vital sign of life, and even though pain is dealt with in the medical model with pharmacology and other prescriptions, and then it's put out of the mind, suffering, however, is a much deeper pain that needs a deeper understanding, mind, body, and spirit, from the many dimensions of societal elements. How is one way that logotherapy treats this suffering?
Yeah, so I did not purposely venture into providing definition of suffering and pain. Of course, the two are different, but they do quite go together. The suffering which refers more to the physical sensation, and the suffering which is more broad because it refers to the different dimension of human being, social, emotional, spiritual suffering. So I believe logotherapy, not to say that logotherapy has an answer to everything. I believe logotherapy as a contribution to bring when it comes to managing suffering in clinical setting. First of all, is to have the courage to acknowledge that there is suffering. Remember, I talked about the three attitudes: fix it, face it, or forget about it. As with the example of someone who is HIV positive and having issues related to violence or poverty and so on, we might very easily say, that's not my problem. I'm just a medical doctor here or a nurse. I'm just giving you the medication. Just take the medication, and that's all. That way, we are forgetting or overlooking the experience of suffering of the client. However, if we take the courage ourselves as a clinician or professionals or even any caregivers to acknowledge the suffering, but remember, as you said, the way I would put it, to always remember that in face of suffering, there is always meaning. Meaning is unconditional. It is always there in all moments in our life. Now, our challenge would be, how do we create a space for us to pick up? Of course, then the question, this of how is one way of logotherapy. Then logotherapy would be, well, what we say here in South Africa. I don't know if it's used in other, but I think there is one logotherapy book which refers to that. We call it logo int. These are cues to meaning in the moment. It's if we have the courage to face the suffering of our client, we would also then connect with this client at a spiritual level and listen to them, listen to their narrative. And while we are listening, pick up to any cues which direct us to possible values they have in their life. And in doing so, listening to those values, we can bring them, present those values to them, those possible values to them, and see if there is an opportunity for them to realize these values. And by doing so, they would fulfill their meaning. Would find things, for example, a mother who's HIV positive and very, very hopeless when she's talking to you, but the moment she talks about her baby, you can see her eyes lighting up. Then one can say, but I've seen this baby seems to be very important to you. But if you have this beautiful, precious baby, what is life asking you to do? Then we move away from take your medication, don't take medication. We move away. Then how do I conduct myself in a healthy way with the right attitude for the sake of my baby?
That's beautiful.
So
Thank you so
yeah,
much. I think
yeah.
we're running
So,
over a little bit, so I really
mm,
appreciate the very
mm.
powerful stories and examples from your own life. I think that's where these conferences become living examples of logotherapy, and you're certainly doing that. So thank you so much. Everyone's going to be taking a break and picking up again in about less than 10 minutes. So thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you, and thank to each one for attending. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.